She did not raise her voice. She did not reach for her badge or her business card, or the kind of proof that a woman like her should never have needed in the first place. She simply looked at the woman in the cream wool coat and said, very quietly, "I have a reservation." And then she sat down. That was the part nobody in the Rosedale dining room could quite believe. Kweku Asante-Osei had spent 23 years building something from nothing, and the nothing had been very real. She had grown up in a two-bedroom apartment in Scarborough with her mother and her grandmother as the space heater that worked when it wanted to. She remembered the specific sound of her mother counting change at the kitchen table, not the romantic version of poverty that people sometimes describe in speeches, but the actual sound of it. Coins on formica. A quiet that meant something serious. She had studied computer science at Ryerson on a combination of student loans and a part-time job at a call center in Mississauga, where she worked the overnight shift 3 times a week. She graduated with honors and $17,000 in debt, and a job offer from a mid-sized tech firm downtown that paid her $38,000 a year. She stayed 3 years. Then she left and started something of her own in her grandmother's dining room, with a second-hand laptop and a legal pad full of ideas that her old supervisor had told her were too ambitious. That supervisor was now on LinkedIn regularly. She had never connected with him. By the time she was 41, Kweku had built and sold 2 companies. The third, a data infrastructure firm called Bassline Technologies, was worth somewhere north of $400 million, depending on who you asked and when. She had taken it public 18 months ago. The coverage had been enormous. Profiles in Maclean's and BNN Bloomberg, and a segment on CBC that her grandmother had watched 3 times on her tablet, though her grandmother would not admit to watching it more than once. Kweku did not talk about money the way some people did. She wore it quietly, the way someone wears good posture, not because they're performing it, but because it's just how they carry themselves now. She drove a dark green Lexus that she had owned for 6 years. She had a house in the annex and a condo she rarely used in Vancouver. She had a tailor she had been going to since her first company was acquired, a Ghanaian man named Mr. Boateng, who worked out of a small shop on Eglinton West and called her Miss K, and never commented on the fact that she always came in needing the same blazer taken in at the shoulders because she kept forgetting she'd lost weight. She was not the kind of woman who went looking for trouble. She was also not the kind of woman who disappeared when it found her. The reservation at Hartwell's had been made 6 weeks in advance. It was that kind of restaurant. The kind where the lighting is designed to make everyone look like they have had enough sleep, where the menus arrive without prices for certain guests, where the maître d' remembers the names of people who have been coming for years and extends a particular species of warmth that is almost, but not quite, the same as actual warmth. Kweku had been there before, twice, for business dinners, once with her friend Josephine, who liked the duck and the fact that you could hear yourself think. She had made the reservation herself, under her own name, through the restaurant's website. She arrived at 7:14 for a 7:15 booking, which was how she always arrived, precisely because she had grown up in circumstances where being late cost things, and the habit had never left her. She was wearing what she always wore when she had no particular agenda: dark trousers, a fitted charcoal blazer, a white shirt open at the collar. No jewelry except the watch, which was understated and which people who knew about watches noticed immediately. She was carrying a tote bag from the AGO gift shop because she had been to see the Lauren Harris retrospective that afternoon and had bought a small book for her niece. She walked in and gave her name to the young man at the front, her name and the time of the reservation and the table for one, because she was having dinner alone, because sometimes she liked to have dinner alone. The young man looked at his screen and smiled and said, "Of course, Dr. Asante-Osei, right this way." She was almost to the table when the woman in the cream wool coat stepped into her path. The woman was somewhere in her mid-30s. She was tall, blonde, with the kind of grooming that takes significant time and money to make look effortless. She was with 3 other people: a man in a blazer who had the easy, entitled bearing of someone who had never had to work very hard for anything he had, and two women in resort wear who seemed to exist in his orbit. They were clearly waiting to be seated. They had clearly been waiting longer than they thought they should have to. "Excuse me," the woman in the cream coat said, not as an apology, but as a summons. Kweku paused. She turned. "Are you being seated now?" The woman gestured at the dining room as if she owned it, or felt she should. "I am," Kweku said. "That doesn't make any sense." The woman said it, the way people say things they have been thinking loudly for several minutes. Not angry yet, but close. "We've been standing here for almost 20 minutes. My father is a major donor to this restaurant's charitable foundation. I'd like to know why someone who just walked in is being taken to a table ahead of us." The maitre d', a man named Philippe, who had worked at Hartwell's for 11 years, and had developed a very finely tuned radar for precisely this kind of situation, materialized at Kweku's elbow with the smooth timing of someone who would have preferred to have arrived 30 seconds earlier. "Mrs. Alderton," he said gently to the woman in the cream coat, "your table is being prepared now. There was a small delay with— I'm not talking to you." Regan Alderton said this pleasantly, which made it worse. "I'm talking to her." She was looking at Kweku the way someone looks at a package that has arrived at the wrong address. "I'm not sure what my presence here has to do with your wait," Kweku said. "It has to do with the fact that there are limited tables and priorities." Regan Alderton said the word priorities, the way people say it when they mean something uglier. "I don't know who made your reservation or when, but I can assure you, my family's relationship with this establishment is long-standing," said the man in the blazer helpfully. "My reservation was made 6 weeks ago," Kweku said. "I'm happy to let them confirm that. That's not actually the point." Kweku looked at her. She took one breath. This was the breath she had learned to take in the years between Scarborough and here. The breath that sat between what she felt and what she chose to do with it. "Then I'm not sure what the point is," she said pleasantly. "Have a good evening." She turned away. What happened next was so fast and so strange that several people at nearby tables would later describe it differently, as witnesses always do. What everyone agreed on was this. Regan Alderton reached out and took hold of Kweku's arm, just above the elbow, and pulled. Not hard enough to cause physical harm. Hard enough to make a statement. Kweku turned back. She looked down at the hand on her arm. She looked up at the woman's face. "Take your hand off me," she said. 3 words. Very quiet, not a request. Regan Alderton released her arm. But she did not step back. "You should know," she said, and now her voice had shifted into something colder, more deliberate, "that my father is Senator Douglas Alderton, and he has relationships with every significant institution in this city. I don't think you want to make this difficult." The dining room had gone quite still, the kind of still that happens in rooms full of people who are pretending very hard to be engaged in their own conversations. Kweku set her tote bag down on the nearest empty chair. She opened it. She took out her phone. "I don't," she said. And it was possible. She was answering a question Regan had not quite asked. Then she placed a call. The person she called was not a lawyer, though she had several. The person she called was not a journalist, though she knew a number. The person she called was Harriet Nkrumah Ease, who was the chief of staff for the Minister of Industry, Science and Economic Development, and who had been Kweku's closest friend since they had both been 19 years old, and broke, and living in a student residence at Ryerson where the showers were unreliable and the heating was philosophical. Harriet was currently in Ottawa. She picked up on the second ring. "I'm in the middle of something," Harriet said. "So am I," said Kweku. "Do you know who Senator Douglas Alderton is?" A pause. The kind of pause that means someone is making several calculations at once. "I know who he is," Harriet said. "Why?" "His daughter just grabbed my arm in the middle of Hartwell's and told me her father's name like it was a threat." Another pause. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine. I'm standing in the restaurant. Is she still there?" "Yes." "Okay," Harriet said. "Hold on." Kweku held the phone at her side for a moment. She looked around the dining room, at the people who were watching from behind their menus. at Philippe the maitre d', who was standing with the particular stillness of a man who had decided that whatever happened in the next few minutes was above his pay grade, at the two women in resort wear who were leaning close together and whispering, at the man in the blazer who was now on his own phone and looking at the floor. Regan Alderton was watching her. She had crossed her arms. "Who are you calling?" Regan said. The confidence was still there, but it had developed a slight edge. "Uncertainty will do that." "Someone who finds your father's name familiar," Kweku said. Senator Douglas Alderton was, by any measure, a careful man. He had been in the Senate for 9 years, appointed under a previous government, and had survived several changes of political weather by being the kind of person who knew when to be visible and when not to be. He sat on 3 committees. He was known for his work on infrastructure funding and for a particular brand of affable, silver-haired reasonableness that played well in certain rooms. He was also under quiet investigation by the Senate Ethics Committee for a series of financial relationships that had been brought to the committee's attention 8 months ago by a whistleblower whose identity was protected and whose evidence was, by all accounts, meticulous. Kweku knew this because Harriet had told her, 6 weeks ago, over the phone, after a glass of wine, in the way that Harriet occasionally shared things she probably shouldn't because she trusted Kweku completely, and because Kweku had signed an NDA that Harriet sometimes forgot about. She had not thought about Douglas Alderton in those 6 weeks. She had not thought about him tonight. She had not come to Hartwell's looking for anything except dinner. But she was very good at understanding systems. She had built several. She understood that systems that are about to fail have a particular sound, if you know how to listen. What happened over the following 48 hours was not dramatic in the way that some things are dramatic. There was no confrontation. There were no raised voices. It was bureaucratic and procedural and almost entirely invisible to anyone who was not inside it. Harriet, in Ottawa, made 2 phone calls of her own that night. One was to a colleague on the Hill, who was also aware of the Ethics Committee investigation, and who had been looking, in the careful, patient way of someone who does things correctly, for a reason to move the timeline forward. The second call was to a journalist at the Globe and Mail named, for the purposes of this story, simply the journalist, because she would not want to be named, and because she had been sitting on a related story for 3 months waiting for confirmation that she no longer needed after Harriet's call. The article ran 43 hours after Regan Alderton touched Kweku's arm in a Rosedale restaurant. The article was about Senator Douglas Alderton's financial relationships, specifically about a series of payments made to a numbered company that his office had never disclosed, and about a construction contract in Northern Ontario that had been awarded, under circumstances that were now receiving attention, to a firm with which he had an indirect but documentable connection. There was no mention of the restaurant. There was no mention of Kweku. There was no mention of Regan. There did not need to be. Kweku was in her office at Bassline Technologies when the article ran. She was in a 3-hour product review meeting, the kind where someone presents a slide deck and everyone in the room is simultaneously thinking about something else. Her phone buzzed several times. She glanced at it once. She saw Harriet's name. She saw the link. She put the phone face down and paid attention to the meeting. Afterward, she sat in her office on the 22nd floor of a building on Bay Street and looked out at the lake. It was a clear day, the kind of day that Toronto occasionally produces in the fall, as if to apologize for what is coming. The water was flat and very gray and very beautiful. Her assistant knocked and came in. "There's a call from a Regan Alderton. She's called 3 times. She says it's important." Kweku considered this. "Tell her I'm not available," she said. "She says she needs to speak with you personally." I understand what she said. She looked at her assistant. "I'm not available." Her assistant nodded and left. 3 days later, Kweku's phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize, a 613 area code. She almost didn't answer. She answered. "Dr. Asante-Osei." It was a man's voice, measured, the voice of someone who had spent decades constructing himself as reasonable. My name is Douglas Alderton. I don't expect you to. I know who you are, Kweku said. A pause. Then you know that things have become somewhat complicated on my end. I read the article. I'd like to discuss. Senator Alderton, she said, and her voice was very calm, the way a very deep lake is calm. I didn't make those calls. I didn't provide any information. I had dinner, and then I went home. A breath. Whatever is happening with the ethics committee has been happening for 8 months. That has nothing to do with me. Silence. I would suggest, she continued, that you speak with your legal counsel. She ended the call. She sat for a moment with the phone in her hand. Outside, the lake was still there. Regan Alderton's call finally came through. Not through Kweku's office, through a mutual acquaintance, a woman who worked in corporate communications and who called Kweku on a Tuesday morning and said, a little awkwardly, that someone wanted to apologize. Kweku said she would take the call. I wanted to say I'm sorry, Regan said. She said it the way people say it when they mean it, but have also been advised to say it. What I did at the restaurant was wrong. I know that. I have known that since the moment it happened. I believe you, Kweku said. She meant it. People often knew exactly when they had crossed a line. Knowing and not crossing were different skills. I don't know what I thought I was doing. I was frustrated, and it doesn't matter. There's no excuse for it. There isn't, Kweku agreed. A long pause. My father's situation has nothing to do with you. I understand that. The things that happened to him, they were already in motion. I understand that too. That's right, Kweku said. I don't know if you can. I'm not asking you to forgive me. Regan's voice had shifted into something less prepared. I just needed you to know that I know. What I did. What it was. Kweku looked at the wall across from her desk. There was a photograph on it. Her and her grandmother at the gala for her first acquisition. Her grandmother had worn a hat. She had been furious that Kweku had not worn a hat. Knowing is the beginning, Kweku said. What you do with it is up to you. She ended the call. She sat with the quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and called her grandmother because it was Tuesday, and she always called her grandmother on Tuesdays. And because some things, regardless of everything else, you simply do not let go. The Ethics Committee concluded its review of Senator Alderton 14 weeks later. He did not resign immediately. He held on for another 6 weeks after that, the way men who have held things for a long time often do. By instinct, even when the holding makes no sense. His office released a statement that described his decision not to seek reappointment as a personal choice made in consultation with his family. Baseline Technologies, that quarter, announced a partnership with 3 Indigenous-led data infrastructure projects across northern Ontario, the kind of work that Kweku had been trying to get traction on for 2 years, and that was suddenly finding doors more open than they had been before. Whether the two things were connected was a matter of perspective. Kweku would have said, not directly. But she had long believed that systems respond to pressure in unexpected directions. You push in one place, something shifts somewhere else. You cannot always predict where. She had learned that in the apartment in Scarborough, listening to her mother count change. There were forces in the world that felt fixed and permanent and immovable. They were not. They were just slow. She had been patient. She had always been patient. She had learned it was the most important thing. On a Friday evening in late November, she went back to Hartwell's, alone as she had intended the first time. She arrived at 7:15 precisely. Philippe was at the front. Dr. Asante-Osei, he said. Welcome back. Right this way. The dining room was warm. The lighting was what it always was, that particular gold that made everyone look a little more rested than they were. She sat at the table by the window. She ordered the duck because Josephine had always said it was worth it, and Kweku had never gotten around to trying it. It was very good. She sat with the quiet of the room around her and ate her dinner slowly, the way she had learned to eat things slowly. Not because she was relaxed, but because she had decided to be. Outside the window, the street was wet with the beginning of the first real snow. The city was doing what the city always did, moving, indifferent, enormous, full of 1,000 stories happening simultaneously in the dark. She finished her meal. She paid. She put on her coat. She walked out into the cold, and she stood for a moment on the sidewalk, her breath making small shapes in the air, and she thought about her grandmother in the apartment on Lawrence Avenue, watching the city through the kitchen window and never once believing the city owed her anything. And somehow, impossibly, building a daughter who built a daughter who was standing on this street with nothing to prove to anyone. She started walking toward the parking garage. The snow was just beginning to settle on the ground. She did not look back.